Leo Panitch. I want to welcome you all to this year's launch of the Socialist Register. We always have our greatest launches, the ones that are most fun, right here at the Lula Lounge. And I really want to thank the people at the Lula for letting us do this. I especially want to thank Frederick Peters, who worked with as liaison between the Register and the Lula in setting this up. And I'm very appreciative of putting all this together. We took a deep breath, the co-editors of the Register, a couple of years ago, and decided it was time that we at least tried to pose the question of strategy in the Register. In years past, this is our 49th volume. Next year's volume will be the 50th of the Socialist Register. It goes back to 1964. And in years past, especially in the 70s, the Register was often annually concerned with questions of strategy. As the defeat of many of the new political movements and political groups that had emerged out of the upsurge of left politics in the 60s and through the 70s, as the defeat that neoliberalism has wrought on the left set in, the question of strategy has not been posed as clearly and as often. And we felt it was our obligation to try to do that. We have 6 people from the local area who have written very important essays in this year's volume. And I think that says a lot about the strength of the Canadian left. Not that it has the answers to strategy, but that we have not become so dispirited as so many people on the left in Europe have. And continue to persist to try to pose that question in a serious fashion. A rather critical review of this year's volume has already been penned as a conclusion to a new book on Lenin by August Nimtz. August points out in this critical review that one of the most notable things in this year's volume is that the question of strategy is insistently posed in the volume from a socialist feminist perspective. And it's indeed the case that a great many of the essays do that, from the way in which Jody Dean and Barbara Epstein look at Occupy, the way that Hilary Wainwright tries to build on Beyond the Fragments in looking at Syriza and Greece, the way Susan Spronk identifies the women's question in Bolivia, and above all, the way in which Joan Sangster and Meg Luxton undertake a critique of Nancy Fraser's retrospective examination of the fate of feminism since the 1970s, and do so from an explicitly socialist feminist perspective. Meg and Joan will be kicking off tonight. They'll be followed by Sam Gindin, who has a piece on the necessity to renew and remake trade unionism from a socialist perspective in the 21st century. He'll be followed by Steve Hellman, who takes a look at Lucio Magri's memoir, The Tailor of Ulm, remarkable document, as an opportunity to reflect on the lessons we can learn from what happened to the Italian Communist Party. John Saul will follow him, and he similarly, in an incredibly topical way, given what's happened with South African miners this year, and the role played by the ANC in this respect, takes a very long and detailed look at what happened to the prospect of South African socialism in the context of the struggle and victory against apartheid. And then finally, Greg Albo, who has the lead piece in this year's volume, which is an attempt to examine alternative economic strategies in relation to the current economic crisis, will attempt to pull all this together. Those of you who haven't yet seen the full lineup will be able to do so by buying a copy of the book, which is in the back room. I want to thank you all for being here. Hopefully there'll be time for questions. We're all going to try to keep our remarks as briefly as possible to allow for that. So I'm not sure whether Meg or Joan is going first.
Thank you. If we were sitting here in the 1930s in Toronto, the socialist feminist who would have offered you a rousing speech, I don't do rousing, but she would have done rousing, was Rose Henderson, an anti-imperialist, a socialist advocate of worker organization, a feminist who understood that women's domestic labor was labor, and someone who believed that women's emancipation was contingent upon socialism and socialism upon women's emancipation. The fact that very few of us know about Henderson points to a certain amnesia about the history of socialist feminism in Canada and beyond. And it was an amnesia about feminist history. In Nancy Fraser's article, there was one factor that prompted Meg and I to write this article. But our piece is not just about one feminist theorist or one position. It's a response to a political viewpoint that has a wider currency, namely that feminism was inevitably seduced, co-opted, sharing an affinity with global capitalism as it briefly flourished in radical form in the 60s and 70s. And indeed that women's paid labor was the means to co-optation, as workplace equality was repackaged as neoliberal competition. While we would agree that we need to reinvigorate feminist debates that have ignored labor and de-emphasized the structural, and we would agree that socialist feminism was marginalized, and also that it's more urgent than ever now to think about class questions given the worsening conditions of life and labor for working class women. We would respond, however, that unless we actually understand the trajectory of socialist feminism, it will be very difficult to tackle those goals. So what I'm going to do is provide a quick overview of just some of the points that we raise in the article, 5 or 6 if I have time. First, if the public face of feminism after the 70s, particularly in the US, was reduced to a liberal manifestation, this was because some parts of liberal feminism do have a structural affinity with capitalism, allowing it to be incorporated. But to assume that women's increased wage labor was the cause mistakes professional rights-seeking feminism for both socialist feminism and the very different reality of working class women's lives. Liberal feminism was unable to come to terms fundamentally with the key outcome of neoliberal economics, which was the widening class differences between women. Second, understanding that some feminisms have an affinity with capitalism has been recognized for over 100 years. Since the 19th century, communist, syndicalist, anarchist, and socialist feminisms have challenged liberal feminism. There is a long history of attempts to combine an analysis of class exploitation with race and gender oppression. And one recurring problem some of these socialist feminists face was how to sustain an anti-capitalist feminism that does not devolve into reformism, something that was faced in the 30s as it was in the 80s. However, even during neoliberalism's ascent, we have to remember that Marxist and socialist feminists were writing, thinking, and acting. The problem was that too few people were listening. Third, we need to develop an analysis that understands neoliberalism as a whole new phase of capitalist expansion with its own dynamic of accumulation that has radically restructured not only production but social reproduction. It's not something that can be tinkered with mildly social democratic policies which have found their own peace or détente with neoliberalism. Perhaps there's more interest in a siren call in social democracy in countries where they have not experienced them in power, as we have. But we should not be trapped in that perspective. And our essay is quite critical of what we call the promiscuous confusion of liberalism and socialism that one see in some writing. Fourth, political theory and strategy have to be developed with attention to historical and spatial specificity, something that the Socialist Register volume overall highlights and is very clear in the article by Brenner and Holstrom that talks about socialist feminist organizing. But generalizing about feminism globally without thinking about different political cultures, paths, parties, becomes a project of hegemony which replicates contemporary and historical amnesia that homogenizes as it forgets and certainly does not account for colonialism and racism. So one of the critiques we have of Fraser is that it's in a very American-centric view. Fifth, there is a forgetting about the role of academic feminism in sidelining socialist feminism that we have to come to terms with and is very apparent in her article. Various post-theories were favored over historical materialism. In fact, the latter was dismissed continually as passé, reductionist, and so on. Feminist theory hurried class to a premature death, even as class was becoming more salient in social relations. Women's lived experience of exploitation and oppression, shaped by race, gender, and colonialism, became an abstract question mark in this theory, when the experiential, including gender and race oppression, should have been one starting point for theory. But the gatekeepers of academic production were not interested in those debates. Six, we need to discuss how the decline of the left reshaped theory as well as practice and distorted what was seen as even politically possible. With the disappearance of left debates, it was easier for those claiming to be socialist feminists, and it became a very elastic term, to lower their expectations and to lower our expectations, and in the US, even to accept the term liberal. Liberalism is not socialism. If there's a message about strategy in what we write, I think it's this, and Meg is going to pick up and go further with this. We need to engage in a theory-building project that creates a feminist historical materialism that is flexible in its openness to connect sexuality and accumulation, historical in its emphasis on specificity and context, dialectical in its emphasis on critique and contradiction, and especially one that integrates experiences of gender and race as building blocks, not as add-ons. A theory that explores how race and gender are part of the constitution of class relations. That theory must fully integrate social reproduction and develop an understanding of identity which does not jettison Marxism, but uses it creatively. Despite the claim in many articles that socialist feminism was defeated, in fact, there have been many creative, engaged efforts to use it. And rather than seeing women's labor as a history of liberal incorporation, we can see it rather as a process of exploitation, but one that is fused with human agency, and thus the potential for changing social relations, the potential for resistance. We have to think big, not small, as Sam Gindin says in his article in the volume. And if we do that, we're thinking more in the vein of Rose Henderson, and that will be a very good thing. Thank you.
Thank you. We try to make a couple of points in the article that go beyond our critique of Fraser's argument. The first has to do with how we know what we know and the importance of history. Like many people who lived through the 60s, I'm alarmed by how much the prevailing interpretations contradict my sense of what happened. This disjuncture between memory and interpretation is not only an inevitable consequence of time passing, it's also arisen because, as the hopeful radical promise of the 60s faded, it was variously dismissed as ridiculous, sinister, and possibly utopian, and it was alternatively reviled and idealized. 60s radicalism has become retrospectively incomprehensible because its framework of assumption has been so thoroughly defeated. And what we need to build on now, we suggest, is a new kind of vision, a new kind of hopeful, radical promise for the current period. Another point we try to make is the importance of revisiting the politics of the women's liberation movement of that period. There was a left-wing current of the women's movement and a feminist current within the left, or at least it tried to be. The socialist feminist politics that developed in Canada in the 1960s, while part of the larger international women's liberation movement, also reflected the unique politics of Canada and generated a sophisticated politics and theory that have largely been defeated in the present period, but which weren't revitalizing. The third point we try to make is that the challenge posed by the politics of women's liberation for the current period, particularly as they relate to particularly as they relate to feminist political economy and what it now calls social reproduction, what most people refer to as managing the competing demands of paid employment and family caregiving under capitalism, is absolutely central. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s insisted that capitalism depends on women's unpaid caregiving and labor, and any anti-capitalist politics must make that issue central if it is to succeed. We argued that that was central to class politics. We never got that on the agenda very effectively. I think the time has come to do that. There are 3 points or principles, I think, that socialist feminism advanced, and they warrant repeating and revisiting. The first is that the liberation of women depends on the liberation of everyone. That as long as one person is oppressed or exploited, we are all at risk. That the overthrow of ruling elites and existing structures requires mass mobilizations, coalitions, and a politics of solidarity that aspire to a genuine democracy, something we can't even imagine at this point, but that we may begin to discover in the day-to-day working out of it. And finally, and this is perhaps the most important acquisition of the women's liberation movement of that period, that the way we deal with and relate to each other, the way we do politics now, the way we live our lives in the here and now, will inevitably shape the future we create. So we can't wait till after the revolution, something that many people were told. Wait till after the revolution, then we'll deal with women's issues. Rather, we have a responsibility to try to live our politics now, however hard that may be. We're living in a very tough time for those of us who are anti-capitalist and aspire to being socialists. Neoliberalism is a project designed to secure the position of capitalist elites. It depends on the exploitation of a global working class population, and it has a deeply vested interest in containing any efforts on the part of working class people to reduce inequalities. Its success depends on persuading or forcing individuals to bear responsibility for social reproduction, which means women, people of color, and working people generally. Central to that effort is a commitment to deny the existence of social classes, of systemic racist exploitation, and of the necessity of women's contribution to social reproduction. Neoliberalism must demonize as vehemently as possible the ideals and promises of feminist, anti-racist socialism. And as we see repeatedly, whether it's the attacks on Theresa Spence, which came out in the paper today, the attacks on Occupy, Idle No More, G20, all of those. Neoliberalism's project is an effort to restrain or prevent progressive mobilizations. It's committed to repressing the history of alternative political movements and to exterminating their visions of how societies might be organized. We suggest in our article that socialist political vision and the goals of the 1960s women's liberation movement offer one oppositional perspective we might find useful today.